service is a good thing, politics can be too. And I think that really spoke to me, especially in a time when it's so easy to be jaded and cynical about getting into politics. So geopolitics provides amazing resources for students to learn about how politics is done, and more importantly, how politics can be done better. So they bring fantastic fellows with experience in government and politics in the media, and they hold events like this that help us learn about what's really going on in Washington, D.C. So that brings us to our speakers today. Professor Ron Clay is a Hoya and is famous among the Gov students for his class presidential debates. He brings decades of experience in politics as a clerk for Justice Byron White and later chief counsel to the Senate Judiciary Committee. He was associate counsel to President Clinton in charge of judicial selection and was involved in selecting and confirming 8 Supreme Court justices. Ex-chief of staff to Vice Presidents Gore and Biden, Professor Klain is now a member of the Geopolitics Advisory Board. Also on the advisory board is Sarah Fagan, a political strategist on the cutting edge of political data and technology. She was White House political director for President George W. Bush and was a senior strategist for his re-election campaign. She has founded 3 consulting companies which revolutionized the use of data and technology in political and issue strategy. And she is currently a contributor for CNBC, where she has written about Trump's pick for the Supreme Court, Neil Gorsuch. And moderating today's discussion is Bob Barnes, who has been a Washington Post reporter and editor since 1987. He joined the paper to cover politics and has served in various editing positions, including Metropolitan and National Politics editor. He has covered the Supreme Court since November of 2006, taking a little time out to cover the conclusion of the 2008 presidential campaign. He gave up his thoughts of law school for a life in newspapers after taking a journalism class at the University of Florida, and someone didn't tell him that apparently he can do both. But you've heard enough from me, so remember to continue the conversation using the hashtag SCOTUS at GU, and please join me in welcoming our speakers today.
Well, it's nice to be here. You students who go to school in the Washington area are so lucky because you get such expertise coming to you. And so my job will be mainly to get out of the way of these two who you want to hear from. I'll ask them some questions and hope that they will interrupt and maybe even argue with each other. And then we'll take your questions too. And so if you see me looking at my watch, it's not because I'm bored, but because I'm going to try to keep things moving along to our schedule. So we all know that there is a current Supreme Court nomination, but I thought maybe we want to talk for just a minute about the previous one, the one that didn't go very far, of Merrick Garland. Wanted to ask you guys, did we see something new in politics with the refusal to hold a hearing on Garland, or did we see a political, sort of the political machinations that always surround nominations, but this one just sort of came out into view with the Senate Republicans saying, we're simply not going to consider this nominee. So did we see something different, Ron?
We certainly saw something different in the extent as far as it went. There's never been a Supreme Court nominee who penned for 8 months without a hearing. That's unprecedented. And the fact that Judge Garland didn't even get a chance to make his case to the country is unprecedented. I think it is an outgrowth of an increasingly politicized and polarized nomination process. And in that sense, I suppose it is a progression of something that started certainly before the Garland nomination. But the outright refusal to give him a hearing, to give him any opportunity to make his case to the Senate, to vote up or down or filibuster or whatever, just to kind of not even give him any chance to be heard, I think is unprecedented and is a very bad precedent.
Sure.
Well, there's one other example where in the last year of an 8-year term, a Supreme Court justice didn't get confirmed or didn't get a chance to get confirmed, really. But I agree with Ron in the sense that this is a hyper partisan time in American politics, and the rules of the Senate that existed even when I started politics here, 10 years ago in the White House, say, longer than that, wow, time flies, doesn't it?
Yeah.
15 years ago are different than they were then, and so, sometimes these things are also, I think, a function of will. I look, the first time Ron and I intersected is in the 2000 campaign, and, in Florida during the recount, George W. Bush led the entire time, but there was such a will on the part of Republicans and activists to win that election because they did not want, another Clinton term. And I think you also saw that here as well. There was a will to make sure that the Supreme Court did not fall into the hands of people who would legislate from the bench, and that is such a core part of conservatives. And I think it was the single most strategically smart thing Donald Trump did in his campaign was to put out a list, because if you sort of think about where Trump was most of his career politically, he's not a conservative. He doesn't have a conservative track record, and conservatives were skeptical of him, particularly religious conservatives. And he put that out, and it was like, okay, I can vote for him, it's okay. And so this is the smartest thing Donald Trump did in the campaign, and to date, I think it's the most effective thing he's done. The rollout of it, this election, has been really well handled on his part.
I was going to ask about that list later, but let me go back. If you had been advising President Obama and the Republican senators had said, we're not going to hold a hearing, don't bother nominating someone, what would you have done? Would you have advised him to make a nomination? Would you have advised him to make a different nomination, perhaps, one that might excite the base? Or do you think he didn't have much of a chance?
Well, when you don't control the Senate, obviously you don't get to set the rules. But he also didn't fight as hard, this is my opinion, he didn't fight as hard for his nominee as one would have expected. And I think I would have advised him to make this election, because it would have really put Mrs. Clinton in a difficult position to then poll somebody who had been sitting there for 8 months. It was sort of his way to have a stamp moving forward. Doesn't mean she would have had to do it, doesn't mean she would have, but it was a way for him to put somebody forward that may have been on the court, and it would have been his imprint either way. But I don't, it didn't become an issue in the campaign as much as I would have thought it would have been on the left.
Ron, as far as I know, you did advise him to pick Merrick Garland.
I did.
Why is that?
Well, I think we haven't had a more outstanding Supreme Court nominee in my lifetime than Merrick Garland. He's an accomplished federal prosecutor. He helped bring the perpetrators of the Oklahoma City tragedy to justice. He served in the Justice Department in other capacities. He served as judge on what's formerly known as the second highest court in the land, the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, where he serves as the chief judge. It's hard to imagine a more qualified person. He was confirmed by an overwhelming bipartisan vote from the Court of Appeals. At the time, Orrin Hatch, senior Republican on the Judiciary Committee, said that this was the kind of person I'd have to vote for the Supreme Court if the president nominated him. And so I thought it was an outstanding pick by President Obama. I think President Obama campaigned very hard for Judge Garland. He did, obviously, presented him in the Rose Garden. Allied groups set up, for the first time ever, in any nomination I've been involved in, set up a kind of a C4 outside PAC organization to campaign for Merrick. We Need 9, campaign on the steps of the Supreme Court, social media, so on and so forth. So I think it was an outstanding nomination. I think there was an outstanding effort behind Judge Garland to get him confirmed. And I think what the Republicans did was impressive. Actually, there's one example in the 19th century of this. But Justice Kennedy sits on the Supreme Court, confirmed in the 8th year of an 8-year president's term, Ronald Reagan, confirmed by unanimous vote of the Senate in the 8th year of a president's 8-year term. So the idea of some historical precedent for what happened to Judge Garland is just wrong. Now, what I will say, though, I think that was interesting, and I think picking up on something Sarah said, we certainly saw in our polling in the Clinton campaign and focus groups that Republican voters were more motivated by the Supreme Court in the election than Democratic voters. and that when you ask people why they were voting for, who they were voting for, Republicans were much more likely to cite the Supreme Court in voting for Donald Trump than Democrats were, and Clinton voters were voting for Hillary Clinton. And so I think some of this, for people like me, falls on us, progressives like me, to do a better job of explaining to our voters why they should care about this more and why our base should be as fired up about the Supreme Court as Sarah's base was. And that wasn't asymmetry in the election. It definitely worked very well for Donald Trump. And I agree with Sarah. I think that Trump's selection of a list of very conservative judges and saying, like, I'm going to pick off this list, helped knit his alliance with conservative voters who were skeptical of him, and it helped bring those people to the polls. You see time again, people said, conservatives said, I held my nose and I voted for Trump because of the Supreme Court. And I think if you're progressive, if you're unhappy with what happened to Judge Garland, the challenge is on us to get our voters as fired up about this as Republican voters will.
Because of what's happened, do you ever think that a president can get a nominee past a Senate controlled by the other party now, or are those days gone?
Well, we're going to find out in the future. I mean, obviously, this is not the case now. We have a Senate controlled by Republicans. The process has become super politicized, super polarized. And I say that like on both sides, not like, oh, it's all their fault, it's all our fault. I mean, I think that if you look at the last 4 Supreme Court nominees, essentially they were all along party line votes. A few extra Democrats voted for Judge Roberts, now Chief Justice Roberts. A few extra Republicans voted for Judge Sotomayor, Justice Sotomayor. But by and large, these were party line votes, and that's a radical change from the way it was even just 15, 20 years ago. It's really so I don't know. I mean, we're gonna, we will find a case where there will be a president of one party and a senate of another party, and we're gonna see what happens.
What do you think, sir?
I think in the foreseeable future, I think unfortunately, your question's probably right. I think that the politics, particularly on the right, and then the left reacts to it and vice versa. I mean, much of what you're saying now about the nuclear option, and I'm sure you'll get to this, and it's possible Neil Gorsuch will get confirmed only through exercising the nuclear option, is a direct result of the fact that Harry Reid did it to Republicans, and they feel justified in changing it now again, potentially now again. And so the parties feed off each other, but I just don't foresee the bases allowing leadership to move forward with someone who they perceive as against them on their core issues, whether it's the environment, abortion, gay rights, any number of sort of core-based issues on either side that polarize the parties. If the person is presented who is considered to be opposed to them, that it's going to be unacceptable, and people are going to be primary over it, which is why you see the partisanship.
It does seem like a new world. One other thing I thought was new in this campaign was that both candidates were very open about the litmus test for the people that they were going to nominate to the court. Hillary Clinton said someone who will overturn Citizens United, someone who is going to protect Roe. Donald Trump said the opposite, someone will overturn Roe and turn it back to the states, someone who is going to be strong on the Second Amendment. That seemed to me to be a much more open way of talking about nominees than I had heard in the past. You both care about politics, but you also care about the court. Is that a good thing or a bad thing that happened this time?
I think it reflects the reality of the politicization of judicial nominations that Sarah and I, both have been talking about. And good thing or bad thing, I think it's the reality. It's hard to know how to reset it, and and I think that I know, Secretary Clinton felt very strongly about issues like choice and Citizens United, and I think it would have been in some ways dishonest for her not to say this is the kind of person I'm looking for. I think there's an effort on both sides to kind of rally their bases around these big important issues. But I think I don't know what would create a more neutral playing ground for these things. I don't know that it's possible. but I don't think it's a surprise that this is more and more explicit each time. I remember I worked on the Clinton campaign in 1992, President Clinton's campaign in 1992, and our position then was we explicitly denied that we had a litmus test. They explicitly said, no, there is no litmus test. So certainly, this has changed a lot since then.
It has changed. Certainly, President Bush said the same thing. He was going to look at people's qualifications, not ask them specifics. I don't think it's good. I don't think it's good for the court. It's now because what you're going to see the outgrowth of it, the natural outgrowth of it is justices, judges are going to have to pick a side and make their case, and they're going to have to, through their writings and their rulings, if they are ambitious and desire to be appointed to these big judgeships, it's going to have to be known where they stand with some of these issues, I think, or at least very clear where they lean. And that, I think, largely is the case in the people that have been nominated most recently. The one now before the Senate and Merrick Garland. It was pretty clear where those folks stood.
Yeah. Well, and as you know, there was a judge, a very well-respected appeals court judge, Jeffrey Sutton, who would have likely been on everyone's any Republican's Supreme Court list, but in a case he ruled in favor of Obamacare. And at the time, it was, what a courageous ruling, but it probably cost him a chance at the Supreme Court. And when the list came out, he indeed was not on the list. But these nominees always fill out a Senate questionnaire. They always say, no one has talked to me about how I'll rule on any issue. But you guys know, right?
Well, you don't know. I want to be really clear about this. Certainly the 4 Supreme Court nominations I worked on, we certainly never asked anyone how you would rule in case A, case B, case C. But these are accomplished people who have extensive writings, and they're mature people, and their position has been developed. And I think that you read their writings, you read their judicial opinions if they're sitting judges, read their academic writings. A lot of judges also write academic articles on in addition to their judicial writings, and you can deduce a lot about them. And so I think there's always uncertainty. There are new issues that come up. I think that's why it's important for presidents to really try to deduce kind of a broader philosophy about a judge. And you don't really know the issues that are going to come up. Picking someone who's going to serve for 20, 30 years, hard to know the issues that are going to come up. And so I think it's important for presidents to focus on kind of what that general approach is to the law, to the Constitution, to issues of civil rights, civil liberties, all these other issues, and really build that into your decision.
No more suitors was the Republican battle cry. How was it accomplished? How did it work out that there haven't been any more suitors on the Republican side?
Well, I think, to Ron's point, in the case of the last 2 Republican nominations, the 2 prior to this one, their views were pretty well defined, but there are still a lot of conservatives who feel like Judge Roberts betrayed the conservative movement because of his ruling on Obamacare. And that was in part, one of the reasons I think Donald Trump, in addition to his own sort of needing to knit together a conservative base, for his candidacy, felt like he needed to put out, really, those folks that the conservatives would be most excited about, based on their writings and their rulings. I'm working on the outside of this one, this current one. I'm not on the inside working it, so I don't know if any questions have been asked of a judge. I suspect any smart judge would say, I'm not going to talk about hypothetical cases, because the reality is, you can ask people their views, their personal views on issues, but their job is to interpret the law. It's not to inject their opinion. And I think most good judges try to do that. And the reality is, you don't know the facts of a case but before the judge. It may be generally, sort of less regulation in their thought process relative to business or environment or any number of issues, but you don't know the facts, and so it's not prudent to put them in a box, and it's not prudent for them to put themselves in a box. And I think most of them, particularly people who get to this level, won't do that. But that doesn't mean, you know, that conversations don't take place kind of philosophically.
Yeah, you're both insiders, so let me ask you a couple of insiders questions. When there is an opening like this, at some point, those of us in the press write that the president has a list, and it's a big list, and then we write that this list has become a smaller list, and sometimes we sort of get it down to 3 people. I don't imagine that that's all because we're like incredibly brilliant reporters. I get the feeling it's because you on the inside want us to know that information. Is that right? What purpose does that sort of narrowing of the list serve and putting it out in the public?
Well, you know, I had a very different experience in the Clinton administration than the Obama administration. Clinton administration.
You considered everybody in the Clinton administration.
Well, no, in the Clinton administration, as you may remember, when we had the first vacancy in 1993, President Clinton had a long and kind of chaotic search. Went on for almost 70 days. Been widely reported he first offered the job to Governor Cuomo, who turned it down. He then offered it to Senator Mitchell, who was the Democratic leader of the Senate, who turned it down. He then went to Richard Riley, who was Secretary of Education. He turned it down. We then went to Bruce Babbitt, who was the Secretary of the Interior. We couldn't find a way to replace him in the Interior Department. We turned him down. So it went on for a long, long time, and ultimately selected Judge Ginsburg. You know, it was a great pick, but a late pick. So that was not so much the whole classic, like we got a list. We'll get to a short list thing. I think the Obama process was much more like that. Look, I think if you're asking, does Last deliberately put out kind of a short list? That wasn't my experience with President Obama, but what was my experience with President Obama is, as part of the thought process, the president consults, you know, prominent lawyers, leaders on Capitol Hill, members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and as you have those conversations, obviously those conversations begin to leak, and those people talk to people, and people say, well, who did he ask you about? Well, he asked me about these 3 people. Well, okay, and when the 4th time someone like Bob calls a senator and says he asked me about these 3 people, then all of a sudden, you know, there's a short list. So we certainly didn't have an avowed strategy of putting out like a list of 3, or 4, whatever it was, but it kind of, you know, came together that way.
I think that's how it happens. That happens on both sides, and that's why you end up hearing the same names over and over. That it's not likely to be calculated that way publicly. Although there are, I think, particularly more on the right potentially than even the left, is that you need to kind of have a trial balloon out there because you don't want to have
sort of
another
crowd vetting to see if there's something turns up.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, Ron is right. The Republican base is much more exercised about this. This is a real issue in the base as to making sure judges, you know, are strict constructionists, as the parlance would go. And when President Bush nominated Harriet Miers, for example, you know, had they put that out 3 days earlier as a trial balloon, it would have become clearer, I think, more quickly that she was taken down by in my view, by the sort of Republican legal intelligentsia, and if they were sitting here, they'd say, hell yeah, we took her down, and we needed to, you know, and they believed that, and so that was a reason why I think you see some of these names popping out on the right to make sure. In Trump's case, because he'd already done it, it was not needed, but that can be a reason to do it.
Tell us what's happening right now. What's Neil Gorsuch or someone in his position doing right now? He's turned in a questionnaire. He's working on an addendum to the questionnaire. He's meeting with senators. But what don't we see?
Well, I suspect if you're anyone being put on the Supreme Court or being put forward for the Supreme Court, you you don't want to get confirmed by nuclear option as an individual. That's not you want to get 60 votes. And so if you're thinking through what needs to happen to get that done, if you're Chuck Schumer, you've got a base that does not want this guy confirmed and feels like Democrats were robbed in the last of their court pick during Obama's last term, and this is justice. So you're managing that, but you're also managing the long view, which is to say, what we do now will set precedent for what happens, if Trump gets a second and a third pick. And so I think it's an interesting chess game that's taking place, because you've got a Gorsuch angle, you've got a legal Republican community angle, and you've got a Democratic angle, and it might be that a couple of them align that don't, for different reasons.
Mm-hmm. Ron, what do you think? What were you preparing?
Well, I think,
nominees
yeah,
for?
I think Sarah, certainly painted like the dynamic here. I think in terms of some of the nitty gritty and the nominations I worked on, I'm sure with Judge Gorsuch, we're less than 2 weeks away from his hearing. Whatever, March 20th is first day, so I guess less than 3 weeks away. I think most nominees, there's some process of having practice hearings, mock hearings, murder boards, whatever you want to call them, where the nominees kind of practice their answers. Look, these people, I'm not a supporter of Judge Gorsuch. If I was a senator, I'd vote against him. But I will acknowledge he's a very smart and accomplished person, and it's not about like teaching him the answers. It's more about helping people like Sarah, helping to explain to someone like Judge Gorsuch, how do you answer these questions, in front of a Senate committee? How do you keep your answers accessible to the public? Because your ultimate audience really is the public out there, and that's not an audience judges often speak to in this kind of way with 70 or 80 million people watching. And so there's a lot of work on that. And in the meantime, I'm sure the White House is busy talking to certainly Republican senators to try to find out what kinds of questions and topics they will have, but also probably Democratic senators on the Judiciary Committee to figure out what are your concerns, what are your questions, what are you going to ask about in an effort to help the judge prepare. I mean, I think that, increasingly, as Sarah and I both stressed, it's a partisanized process where people's views fall on party lines, but still, these nominees can affect the outcome by their performance at the hearings, and the better their performance, the better they're going to do, and so they're trying to improve their performance, and I'm sure there's a lot of work going on that.
I'm going to ask one more, and then I'll take your questions too, and maybe I'll ask some more, and we'll mix it in a little bit. You said that you would vote against Judge Gorsuch. Senators look at qualifications, they look at credentials, they look at experience, they also look at ideology. And so do you think ideology is a perfectly good criteria for a senator to use in deciding to vote against a nominee?
Yeah, I do. I've always believed that. I think that the nomination and confirmation of Supreme Court justices should be a dialogue between the branches, and a dialogue between the parties. And I think that when a president picks someone that kind of straddles the gap and hopefully is more moderate, then that person merits votes from the opposite party. I think Judge Gorsuch is one of the most conservative people, if not the most conservative person that Donald Trump considered, and is as far to the right as he could pick. And so I don't think it's wrong for Democratic senators to say, look, President Trump, you were elected, you get to nominate, got it. I was elected, I get to vote. And the voters who elected me, I don't want to see me vote for someone this conservative. And I think given how far out there Judge Gorsuch is on a lot of these issues, I think that's the reaction you're going to see from the vast majority of Democratic senators. Now again, as I said, I always think it's wrong to guess the outcome until you see the hearing, until you see what he says, until you give him a chance to be heard. But certainly based on everything I've read by Judge Gorsuch and about Judge Gorsuch, I would be a no voter. But I'm a voter.
How should ideology fit in to a senator's decision making?
Well, I think it's hard for it not to. You know, I mean, it's interesting. These judges, you know, Ron would certainly know those nominated by the Democrats, but I have interacted with the last three, including Gorsuch and the two that I worked on when I was in the White House on the confirmation team, and they would cringe at the thought that most of them would cringe at the thought that they had an ideological view on things. I mean, they really aren't. You know, they're not political people typically at all, and they it's not that they don't have views on issues, but you know, I think they would cringe at this conversation, and you know, it really gets down to the way they interpret the law, right? And you know, there's at a very high level, there's those that believe that, you know, the law as written should be interpreted exactly as it is, and there are those that say, well, times change, circumstances change, you know, issues evolve, and we need to take the law and then, you know, think it through relative to how it impacts people today. And, you know, if that's what you mean by ideology, you know, that's probably perfectly appropriate. I personally don't think it's right to ask people if they're pro-life or pro-choice, or if they're pro-Second Amendment or against Second Amendment. That's not the job of a justice. They should not have. They may have views on those issues. How could you not? It's not their job to put their views in. Their job is to interpret the law and to be a fair and impartial judge. Now, that's not what our politics calls for today, but you know, that certainly 15 years ago the courts worked a lot better, and these nominations worked a lot better, and that's generally the way people looked at these nominations.
I certainly agree that the job of a judge is to interpret the law, and particularly the Supreme Court to interpret the Constitution. There are different theories of constitutional interpretation, and I'm a progressive textualist. I believe we should believe in interpreting the text of the Constitution. The text of the Constitution is a very progressive document. It's not a conservative document. We wrote the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments at the end of the Civil War to reunite the country. We wrote the 17th, 18th, and 19th Amendments in the height of the progressive movement in this country. And there's a great deal of progressive text in the Constitution. I think Judge Gorsuch, you know, has a view that is, you know, very close to what's called the originalist view, and that's it may not be any. I mean, I don't want to get semantic about whether that's an ideology or an interpretive theory, but it's a point of view that informs how he reads cases, and I think it's, you know, I don't think it's really faithful to the text. I think it's a you know, point of view that is a certain kind of political veneer on the Constitution, and I think certainly, you know, I absolutely agree with Sarah that like no one should be asking these judges their personal political views. I don't really know if Judge Gorsuch, if he were a senator, how he would vote on this bill or that bill or whatever. But having read a lot of his opinions and having read, you know, a lot of one of his speeches, I'm pretty confident I know how he's going to rule on major cases before the Supreme Court.
Let me get you to ask some questions. I can't do this by myself. Yes.
Thanks to both of you for being here. Mr. Clanning, thank you for following me back on Instagram. That was a big day for me.
Excellent. Well done.
My question is about Judge Gorsuch. As a liberal, I'm not a fan of his, but I don't think it's as bad as we could have gotten with Trump. Like, I feel like a Rubio type might have appointed Gorsuch. My question being, if he's confirmed and then another opening comes up on the Supreme Court, do you think we'll see another one in like the sort of traditional conservative style of judge appointed, or would it be, you know, someone more on the Trump wing of the party?
I think Donald Trump has a list, and he can't go off his list politically. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think I don't think because of sort of the relationship he's built with the, you know, with the. I suppose it's always possible you could have a new appointee now to a lower court that 4 years from now be appointed. That's a possibility. You could see Trump wanting to only have Trump picks. Probably the one thing he probably doesn't like about Gorsuch is that it was a Bush pick that he then had to now. So he's always described as a Bush pick first, at least to start his judicial career. So I think that list is that list, and that's where you're going to see his picks come from.
I heard he was felt hemmed in by that list and knew that he had to make the first choice from it. But some people I've talked to said they wouldn't be surprised to see someone not on the list be the second choice, if there is one, we don't know.
Yeah.
Who else? Yeah.
So given the increasing polarization that both of you just acknowledge isn't a reality, would we kind of be better off, assuming what I'm about to say would be politically feasible, to kind of go to a system that some law professors have proposed, and essentially doing an 18-year term with rotating expiration dates, so in every 4-year term you get 2 appointments. So no, like in theory, no more, barring like an emergency, like somebody like dying unexpectedly or just retiring unexpectedly, but no more, no less. Everybody gets 2. It's just a way to take these like the last year, like lame duck political squabble out of it, or what we're kind of seeing now with the Democrats trying to hold strong and potentially delay or obstruct the nominee. Now, would it just be better for the system if we tried to remove that squabble out of it by essentially changing how we do Supreme Court terms or Supreme Court structures?
Well, I think life tenure is a good thing. Federal bench. I think notwithstanding what Sarah and I talked about, I think it's a counteractive factor against that, and hopefully it guards against that. And what I will hypothesize as a thought experiment is if anyone thinks that the Republicans would have confirmed Merrick Garland if he were the result of like one of these 18-year terms coming up, and I just don't think it would have changed the outcome. I think they would have. I don't think it's really a fix for the situation we have, and I do think life tenure does give the judges independence, and not looking for like what's my job going to be after I finish on the Supreme Court, what's my next career or whatever. I think it's something the founders put in the Constitution, and something I think is a good thing.
I agree with that. That's a very strict interpretation of the Constitution.
It's a textual interpretation.
Nobody knew these life terms were going to be so long, though.
Well, true enough, people live longer. It's nice, it's good. Good that people live longer.
I want to ask a little bit about the timing of how this all played out. So we had Republican senators who probably at the time didn't think that Trump was going to win. We had Hillary ahead 5 to 8 points pretty much the entire time. So politically, do you think that was strategic in that they sort of said, okay, we're probably not going to win come November, but on the off chance that we do, maybe we can get a nominee in there? How much do you think the timing played into it rather than just partisanship? Like, do you think if the timing was different, then Republicans wouldn't have fought as hard as they did to keep Garland out? Or
It's probably fair. I mean, the fact that it came up in the last year, and we were marching toward a presidential election, and the fault lines had been defined. Certainly, if it happened 2 years earlier, I think it would have been really hard for Republicans to not confirm. But in some ways, the fact that Merrick Garland didn't get confirmed, to your earlier question, it's like now it is okay to not do it, right? And so we'll see if people stay out there for 3 years in the future. If the Trump appointee sits out there for 2 years, let's say Democrats took control of the Senate in 2018. Should be hard, but if that happened, we'll see.
Hi, thank you very much for being here today. Two quick questions. One, what was your feelings on that handshake during the introduction, and for Judge Gorsuch? And also, is there a possibility that we're going to get another Warren, somebody who held elected office, and how would you prepare for that differently than you would somebody who is just on the bench?
Well, I have no view on the handshake. I'll let Sarah defend or oppose the handshake. It's interesting. President Clinton, in 1993, really had the idea very strongly that he wanted to pick someone who came from more of a public realm and not a sitting judge for the Supreme Court. As I kind of very quickly alluded to, we did a lot of probing of that, a lot of thinking about that, and so on and so forth. It is the case that every current member of the Supreme Court was a sitting federal judge, except for Justice Kagan, who had a quasi-judicial role as Solicitor General of the United States. And there's no one on the court right now who has that kind of profile, or Warren kind of profile, or even really, you know, the profile that even Justice O'Connor had from kind of Arizona politics before she became an intermediate appellate court judge. They're all from the federal appellate bench, and you know, I think that's unfortunate. You know, I think that having someone with a kind of different life experience would be a great thing to have on the Supreme Court. What I will say is that, given the microscope these people are put under once they're picked, and all the things Sarah and I've been talking about tonight, it would be hard to get someone from politics confirmed in the Supreme Court. That, you know, every speech they ever gave, every vote if they were senator or congressman, every vote they ever cast, and I think Senator Day O'Connor is a good example. There's no way a Republican president would nominate Senator Day O'Connor today. There's no way a Republican Senate would confirm Senator Day O'Connor today. She had all kinds of votes in the Arizona legislature that would have been considered like too liberal by today's Republican Party standard. And so I think it's unfortunate we have a process that really forces these presidents to pick among federal appellate court judges, but it kind of is the process we have now.
I agree with all that.
Handshake?
Oh, it's weird. I think people overthought it.
Fair
It was
enough.
an awkward moment.
It's kind of weird that he came out by himself. I've never seen that before. It's always the president coming out with the nominee, and in this one, Trump came out by himself and talked for a while before bringing out the nominee. I thought that was a strange thing. And the other thing that I would say is, after covering politics and covering the court, you find that the justices are very different people from politicians.
They
They may know politics, but they are not comfortable really in that world. And I think vice versa. I'm not sure a politician would be very happy going to the life of a justice, but it would bring certainly a different experience. I think, for instance, when you hear the court debate a campaign finance case, you think they really don't have any idea about how campaigns are run. What do you have a question?
Can you imagine polarization proceeding further to the extent that we see impeachments of Supreme Court justices?
God, I hope not. I mean, and I don't think so. I mean, I think that, you know, I think, I certainly hope not. I don't think you're getting to that extent. You obviously need extraordinary majority in the Senate to convict and remove a justice, and you know, not since the 18th century we tried to impeach justices over their decisions. So I certainly hope it wouldn't go that way, and I don't think it will wind up that way.
Yeah, I hadn't actually ever even considered that recently, and I guess I agree with Ron. I think they'd have to have some extraordinary personal issue that they just need to be removed for some, reason for the respect of the court.
We talked a little bit about the filibuster and about the idea of, well, we didn't talk about it, but so let me ask you, should it be that a justice to the Supreme Court should have to get 60 votes, just sort of because it's such an important job, or have the Democrats made their bed and now they have to lie on it?
I think they made their bed and they have to lie in it. And, it's not, recent judges have not gotten 60 votes. They've got 60 votes to end debate on the nomination, but, you just need a majority to confirm the court.
Yes, recent judges have not got, justices have not got 60 votes, but you have required 60 votes or consensus to end debate. I hope that would stay the rule. Democrats didn't make their bed on Supreme Court nominations. Democrats explicitly made the bed and said Supreme Court nominations will not be subject to the nuclear option, Supreme Court nominations could be filibustered, and said that at a time when we didn't really know if how many people President Obama would nominate the Supreme Court and what the composition of the Senate would be. So in terms of how Democrats made their bet on this, Democrats certainly we couldn't cry foul for lower court judges getting confirmed without a 60-vote margin in debate, or administrative nominees. Absolutely, we definitely made our bet on that. And if you don't like how the votes went down on Betsy DeVos or other things, we set that up, but we did not do that on Supreme Court nominations. And I would hope that Senator McConnell and others would honor the precedent that's there and would maintain the filibuster rule. And let's see how it plays out. Let's see what the debate is. Let's see what happens. Let's see where the votes line up.
Although I do remember Vice President Kane saying, if Republicans keep blocking the Supreme Court, that we'll have to get rid of the filibuster.
Well, I think that he certainly threatened that as a possibility. But again, the people who made the rules here were Senator Reid and the Democrats in the Senate, and the rule they put in place was a rule that exempted the Supreme Court from the abolition of the filibuster of nominations. And so, the shoe was on the other foot, obviously, and we'll have to see.
We have a few more minutes. Does anyone else have a question? Yeah.
Hi. So, originally the filibuster was nuked because there was just generally in the judiciary, so little, Republicans would never agree to send, any lower court justices, appointed, so they had to nuke it eventually, and just, there's, across the board this general politicization of the judiciary. Is there, any solution at all for it in the future, or is it just going to be a fact of life now that it's going to be a very contentious political battle to appoint lower court judges, Supreme Court judges, because of the big influence they have now on laws?
I don't know. I mean, I think that, there, certainly I think one reason why they got rid of the filibuster for lower court and executive branch nominees was in part this, but in part just the clunkiness of the process and how long it was taking. I think the thing that was most frustrating to the Democrats was you'd have people putting holds and insisting on 60 votes on the nominee, and then when the nominee would get up there, he'd get confirmed 97-2, right? And so why did this person have to pen for a year and a half to get confirmed 97-2? And so I think that kind of expediting the process for confirming lower court nominations and executive branch nominations made a lot of sense. I hope, in New York, for example, had been for many years a long-standing practice of a bipartisan way of selecting judges for the entry-level federal courts, the district courts, where basically both the Republicans and the Democrats would get together and they'd have a joint commission and they would pick people, and the party in power would get, of every 4 judgeships, the party in power would get 3 and the minority power party would get 1. This is how it came to be that President Bush put Sonia Sotomayor on the court, ultimately, obviously, President Obama put on the Supreme Court. I think thinking about things like that for the lower courts, ways in which there could be a little departisanization of the selection process, I think would be a healthy development.
I think it's a longer-term solution that probably involves redistricting reform and a different makeup of the Congress, which means a different, ultimately, makeup of the Senate, and down the road, that, you have a many decades process, I think, where some of, because of political reform, that has an impact on everything, including courts.
Okay, lightning round of things I want to know. One-on-one meetings with the senators, theater, or is there any purpose to that?
I think there's real purpose for them, yeah.
What?
Well, I think that, look, it takes, for somebody who wants to do the right thing, it's really easy to not do the right thing when you've never met the person and never had a conversation with them about their philosophy and specific cases and, what was their thinking process on a ruling or what have you. So, for given the times we live in, for Neil Gorsuch, who's got such a great personality and is a very likable person, I think there probably are Democrats like Manchin and Heidi Heitkamp and Joe Donnelly in Indiana who are thinking through, the politics of this, but, it makes it easier for them to vote for this person if they spend time with them.
super useful. Look, this is one of the most important votes a senator is going to cast in his or her term in the Senate. He's going to pick someone who will almost certainly outlast them as a major decision maker in public life. And so I think anything that can make that vote more informed, that can give them insights about the person, I think is a useful thing. And so certainly Justice Ginsburg's nomination, I sat in on a lot of the one-on-ones. They were interesting conversations. They weren't always, they weren't ever like, how would you vote on this case? How would you vote? There were people trying to get to know them, know the way they think, outside of the television lights, outside of the hearing dais. And I think they were helpful to the senators and helpful for her.
For those of you who haven't heard the story, Justice Kagan talks about how he was in one of these one-on-ones and a senator asked what she knew about guns, and she said basically she was from New York and she didn't know anything about guns, and but she said, but if I'm confirmed, why don't you take me hunting? And she says that the senator had a horrified look on his face, and so as a result, when she got on the court, she asked Justice Scalia to take her hunting, and that's how their whole shooting and hunting thing got started.
Yeah.
One justice told me once that the White House told them early on in the process, this is what the vote's going to be on you, and the vote was almost exactly that. So does that mean that the two of you, when you started this process with your nominees, knew pretty much what was going to happen, and we all spent a lot of time getting to that point that you knew was going to happen?
I think basically that's right.
Well, again, I would say this is something that has changed over the years. So I would say with the Ginsburg and the Breyer nomination, the first two I worked on, you generally didn't know how they were. I mean, we were very confident that they were going to win. We had a Democratic Senate, they were Democratic nominees. But what the vote would ultimately be was kind of up in the air. And in the end, at that time, Justice Ginsburg, I think I confirmed 96-3. Justice Breyer confirmed 90-9. That was kind of hard to know. I think in more recent times, they're kind of straight party line votes, and you can kind of guess the senators who are in play, who might cross party lines to vote for a nominee of the other party, and if you're, and so I think you can probably narrow it down pretty easily. My guess is at the White House, they have a plus or minus 2 guess on the Gorsuch nomination, and my guess is they'll probably be right.
You think that's right?
Yeah, I do.
Anything else before we let them go? Well, please join me in thanking them.
Have a good spring break, everybody.
Yeah, enjoy.
Make
Yeah, I
good
can't
choices.
believe you're
Huh? Always looking out for my children. So we're going to snack good